where fences are going to be placed, the boundaries, and the existing species ranges, right? So she modeled out what would happen under different scenarios within invasive forests. She looked at what's going to happen with ag and ranching development. So the inputs to this process were the existing agricultural boundaries and important agricultural lands, and the additional lands that have since been taken out of production, and the productivity and importance rating system. So you can see the current ag land is basically HCNS and my little coffee plantation I showed you earlier. And in the future, this is all what has been at some point designated ag or has been ag. So we could imagine that that would go back into ag production of some sort, or ranching. Then the next change that happens in the future is land cover development. So this is paving over paradise. So they looked at the existing development projects, the Maui growth boundaries, and planned development projects. And so all of these scenarios were done in collaboration and in consultation with the Maui County. And the idea here is that they redrew the boundaries under different intensities. So you would have high intensity, low intensity, medium intensity, and open space. And the different projections for the future would be a certain amount of development of each of those. And then finally, the stream diversion, restoration, and dams. So the hydrology is swirly on Maui because of all of the ditch systems, the reservoirs, et cetera. And so some of these are out of commission or being decommissioned, some are being restored, and some of the water has historically was diverted and now isn't, so getting an understanding of kind of those hydrological processes in the future. So the green scenario, basically this is where likely all of us in this room would like to live. There's no native species loss, there's a low amount of invasive growth, but there's active restoration inside the boundaries of where they're fenced. Only 60% of the planned development projects actually end up getting completed 100 years from now. And there are additional important agricultural lands designated, and the ag is diversified. So that's the green scenario. The middle scenario, we start to get native species loss outside of the fences. There's additional invasive species growth. There's some passive restoration inside some new fences. 100% of the planned development projects are actually built, and there's a loss of ag land to development and somewhat diversified ag in the future, so less sugarcane, more other things. And finally, the growth scenario. So here, everything's gone to hell. We have native loss outside of the fences, invasive growth. No new fences are built, none of the exclusionary fences for invasive species. 100% of planned development, and even additional development outside of the growth boundaries. We see a loss of ag land, sugarcane transitions not into ag but into grassland, and there's no diversification of the ag sector, right? So those are the future scenarios that we're going to be running through our model. And then coupled with a climate model, so this comes out of Kevin Hamilton's lab in SOEST, and we'll be looking at they've dynamically downscaled the model for Maui to a 1 kilometer resolution. So we're inputting the evapotranspiration and the rainfall data from his models to do our 100-year scenarios. So how this links then together is that we have these scenarios, so these 100-year scenarios, right? And those result in a change in the stressor levels, so the nutrients, the sediments, the water yield, which get inputted into the core set model and change the reef attributes, which then, through an ecological production function, show you where the ecological production, the ecosystem services are changing, and the valuation then can tell you what the impact on human well-being is, and show you where in the landscape you should focus your management efforts. And this is actually, so we're collaborating with the EPA, and they're doing a very similar process in the Caribbean. So we've been sharing models back and forth and trying to translate some of the different things we're learning here in our mountainous islands and some of the things they're doing there, and vice versa. On the 5 to 10 year period, it's a very similar process of running a scenario, but now the scale is totally different, both temporally and spatially. Now we're talking about, managers need to know, like, should I put the fence over here, or should I put it over here? Should I restore this area, or should I restore that? Should I focus on road rehabilitation, or should I put in riparian buffer zones? Like, in much smaller scale than what we were just talking about on the 100-year time scale. And so what our models are, what we're trying to design them to be able to do is to capture that scale as well. So that you can ask a question like, all right, we're going to do pig control, and we want to know what the impact is on erosion, and then be able to translate that into coral reef and the ecosystem services we care about, like fish and recreation. And so this process, we're working with the Ridge-to-Reef to identify these best management practices and where on the landscape they anticipate and when they anticipate doing them, in order to help them identify the most cost-effective management measures. And we link that with the kind of multi-objective decision-making process of providing them with spatial maps that provide information on the levels of delivery, the hotspots and the conflict zones, the interactions and the trade-offs. So let me skip to the, I've done that. Let me skip to the interactions and the trade-offs. So this is a study that came out. This is from a watershed in Wisconsin. And what we'll be able to do is show for each one of the ecosystem service kind of where on the landscape it's important, right? And we'll be able to, pulling out two of them, crop production and water quality, we'll be able to show where they conflict, right? So in this case, they were able to show that, not surprisingly perhaps, that areas where crop production showed a higher probability of nitrogen pollution in the groundwater, right? But we'll be able to do this with each one of the ecosystem services. And lastly, we'll be developing trade-off curves. So this is a kind of a combination of multi-objective decision-making with economic theory. And the idea here is that if we have a scenario that, a management scenario where they say, well, okay, we want to fence this area off to control pigs, how much sediment will it reduce, right? Our predictive model will be able to say, well, the sediment export is somewhere, kind of medium high. But the management costs are actually quite high because it's really expensive to build a fence, right, where you're proposing to build it, right? And then they might say, okay, well, we have a different scenario up here, different management scenario, different option. Instead of doing the fence, we want to build riparian buffer zones, let's say, right? And we'd be able to model and predict, like, okay, well, the sediment export from that is quite a bit lower. And as a matter of fact, the management costs are lower too, right? And we run this analysis for any number of options, management options that the managers pose to us. And we develop a landscape like this, where each point is a different management option that they want to evaluate. And basically, the recommendation is that you want to operate somewhere along this, what we call the efficiency frontier. Because at any point underneath here, for that same cost, you could get more benefit, right? Or for any point like this way too, for that you could, at less cost, you could get that same benefit, right? Those of you who take in economics, it's Pareto optimal, right? This is Pareto in efficient space. And so with building the predictive model, we'll run for any number of, we're talking with the managers to come up with these options that they're actually evaluating in order to give them some guidance on the best bang for your buck. Where should you be operating on this efficiency frontier? Okay, that's the project in a nutshell, and I'd be happy to dig into the details and explain things in more detail if you would like to hear it. Thank you very much.
So I saw that Honolulu Bay, right? The coral reef health is gone from 42% to 9% or something, but it's a protected area. And are you guys finding any linkage preliminary, like why the coral reef cover is decreasing so rapidly there?
Why it decreased? Ecologists in the room. Honolulu Bay. I mean, I know more for like the kind of keeling that's been studied a bit more, like there's the extraction of the herbivores. And Honolulu, it is a highly, it has a lot of sediment, right? It's a pretty sediment impacted bay, and no marine protected area can stop that, right?
The sediment is the stream is diverted, right? In Honolulu.
A lot of it, yeah, a lot of it is diverted, but nonetheless, if you snorkel there, you can see about 7 feet. And I think the loads, from what Chris Brocious actually has a sediment gauge now on that river, on that stream, trying to, and it's quite high. The actual empirical sediment is quite high, surprisingly.
Does it have to do with the fallow ag land?
So not up there as much. Honolulu doesn't have as much ag land as the lower areas. It's more of, mountainland and pine kind of doesn't get all the way up into the west. So it is a wild, more wild. But yeah, we're trying to figure out.
Well, I can understand one thing. Is this your research is primarily focused on land use system or land cover system?
Both. I mean, so depending on that's one of the things that I kind of glossed over, is depending on the model, like SWAP, for instance, the hydrological model is really good at looking at land management, right? Some of the other ones, it's mainly about the land cover. So we'd like to be able to talk about both.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the main driver for the long-term scenarios, it's land cover, right? That's the main change. For the shorter term, it's the land management.
Is it not very difficult to really find the data for land use system?
For land use?
Yes.
In terms of like what people are going to, what the landscape's going to look like. Well, I mean, we have the PECRI has put together the scenarios for what's going to happen 100 years from now, over the past year in consultation with experts on Maui, of the 3 likely growth scenarios, what it might look like.
So those management scenarios was very much like a community process.
Those the 100-year development
Yeah,
scenarios, yeah, those were done, those were led, and there were many consultations with the county and the communities and landowners. Yeah, and as a matter of fact, some of it's kind of touchy because there's some, as soon as you put lines on a map, people get freaked out that, wait, my project's not on there. Does it mean I'm not going to get approved in the future? So some of it we had to obscure as well. But
in this project, you employ the different type of model to predict, for example, hydro and segment and other the marine process. Right? So many researchers use the different model to get to their purpose, but every model generates some uncertainties. So
yeah.
I just wonder how you can control different uncertainty in different steps.
yeah, I mean, and the uncertainty cascades through too, right? Because the uncertainty from the hydrological models gets picked up by the coral reef model, right? And so this is something that all the ecosystem service modelers struggle with, and I don't think there's no consensus and there's no answer to your question either. But I mean, what we try to do is represent the uncertainties as honestly as possible, and do things like Monte Carlo analysis and things like this to try to have some sort of a representation, do simulation, sensitivity analysis, to show like how certain we are of certain inputs, and if these are wildly wrong, how off would our recommendations be? Yeah, it's not a satisfying answer because we haven't really dug into that as much yet. And it always comes up. The question always comes up. I should have a satisfying answer.
I can't remember. Did you include the ocean acidification component, or is it difficult to include that, or is it specific reason not?
So we're somewhat, well, we're right now we're limited by what Corset can handle, right? Because that's the coral reef model we've chosen to run now. And what we'll be able to do is force it, as you know how I had those drivers and I circled land-based source pollutants. So one of the drivers in there is climate change, right? So with that, we'll be able to force the input, the change in coral cover, for instance. So if we have some external predictions of what acidification is going to do to the ecosystem attributes, then we can model the trophic dynamics with that input. So it would be an external prediction, based on lip review or based on some other studies that would say, given this scenario of climate change, we would expect this to happen to the coral reef, certain percentage of bleaching or whatever it is, and we'd be able to put that through. But it's still, the Corset model is still a really rough estimation of what's going to happen. So how well we'll be able to pick up acidification is yet to be seen.
Well, if there's no more questions, please join me in thanking Dr. Oleson.